There is such a thing as evil, and some people are evil.
He was the scariest criminal I ever came across. You could see it in his eyes. He just had that stare in his eyes.
This is new surveillance video that shows the moment a gunman opened fire on a home, wounding 5 people.
Prison. For most of us, it's the ultimate form of punishment, a place where freedom dies and hope fades. But for some of the world's most notorious cartel leaders and gangsters, prison was just another battleground. They thought they'd seen it all, done it all. They believed they could run their empires from behind bars, untouchable and invincible. But they were dead wrong. In the concrete jungle of America's toughest prisons, these kingpins learned a brutal lesson. There's always a bigger predator. From mob bosses to drug lords, these men who once ruled the streets with iron fists found themselves at the mercy of a system they couldn't control and enemies they couldn't escape. Today, we're diving into the dark world of prison justice, where notorious gangsters meet gruesome ends. From a mob boss beaten to death hours after transfer to a cartel leader stabbed by his own gang, these stories will chill you to the bone. Are you ready to step into a world where the most dangerous men on earth become prey? Let's begin. Let's kick things off with a man who was as old school as they come in the gangster world, James Whitey Bulger. Now, you might be thinking, another mob story? But trust me, Whitey's tale is anything but ordinary. Born in 1929, Bulger came up in a tough neighborhood during the Great Depression. He got his start in crime early, working his way up from petty theft to armed robbery and truck hijacking. But Bulger wasn't content with being a small-time crook. He had big ambitions, and he was smart enough and ruthless enough to make them happen. By the 1970s, Bulger had become one of the most powerful gangsters in Boston. He controlled rackets ranging from loan sharking to drug trafficking, and he wasn't afraid to use violence to keep his grip on power. But what made Bulger really stand out was his relationship with the FBI. You see, Bulger wasn't just a gangster, he was also an FBI informant. For years, he fed the feds information about his rivals, particularly the Italian mafia. In return, his FBI handler, John Connolly, tipped him off about investigations and essentially gave him a free pass to run his criminal empire.
He's the scariest criminal I ever came across. You could see it in his eyes. He just had that stare in his eyes, 1,000-yard look. He was just ruthless. He was just ruthless.
This alliance between Bulger and the FBI went on for years, with Whitey becoming more and more powerful. He was involved in all sorts of crimes, including at least 11 murders. But because of his deal with the FBI, he seemed pretty much untouchable. He walked around South Boston like he owned the place, which, in a way, he did.
They just knew they had the bases covered. And in the end, they thought they'd always hold that ace, that they were informants for the FBI.
But here's the thing about playing both sides. Eventually, it catches up with you. In 1994, Bulger got word that he was about to be indicted, so he did what any self-respecting gangster would do. He went on the run. For 16 years, Bulger was one of America's most wanted fugitives. He was right up there with Osama bin Laden on the FBI's most wanted list. While he was on the run, Bulger's legend only grew. There were sightings reported all over the world. Some people thought he was in Europe, others swore they'd seen him in South America. All the while, the FBI was chasing leads and coming up empty-handed. But in 2011, the law finally caught up with him. Bulger, then 81 years old, was arrested in Santa Monica, California, where he'd been living under an assumed name. He'd been hiding in plain sight all along, living in a nice apartment with his longtime girlfriend.
James Whitey Bulger will begin the sentencing phase tomorrow in federal court. The former leader of Boston's notorious Winter Hill gang will soon learn whether he'll spend the rest of his life locked up after being convicted of racketeering and murder charges.
Bulger's rap sheet was a mile long and getting longer by the minute. Racketeering, money laundering, extortion, you name it, Whitey had done it. But the real kicker? His involvement in 11 murders. When the judge finally got his hands on Bulger, he didn't just throw the book at him. He hurled the entire library. 2 life terms plus 5 years, just to make sure. It seemed like justice had finally caught up with the notorious Boston gangster. Case closed, right? Time for Whitey to fade into obscurity behind bars. But if you thought that was the end of Bulger's story, you'd be dead wrong. And I mean that quite literally. Fast forward to October 2018. Bulger, now a frail 89-year-old, gets transferred to the United States Penitentiary, Hazleton, in West Virginia. Now, let me paint you a picture of Hazleton. They don't call it Misery Mountain for nothing. This place is the Thunderdome of the federal prison system. Violent, unforgiving, and not exactly a retirement home for elderly gangsters. For a man with Bulger's history of ratting out fellow criminals, it was like being tossed into a shark tank with a neon sign reading "snitch" hanging around his neck.
The criminal turned FBI informant who was captured after 16 years on the run was found dead this morning in a federal prison in West Virginia.
Within 12 hours of arrival, he was found in his cell, or what was left of him anyway. The scene was something straight out of a horror movie. Bulger had been beaten to death with a sock filled with padlocks, but his killers didn't stop there. In a final act of brutality, they'd attempted to gouge out his eyes and slice off his tongue. It was a grisly end that seemed almost poetic in its savagery. A man who'd spent his life dealing in violence, meeting an unimaginably violent end. In the end, his past caught up with him in the most violent way possible.
I'm surprised it took that long, to be honest with you.
And why do you say that?
You just ratted out a lot of people. I'm surprised it wasn't early, that's all.
Bulger's story is a perfect example of how a life of crime eventually comes full circle. He might have thought he was untouchable, but in the end, he died alone in a prison cell. So let this be a reminder that no matter how smart you think you are, no matter how many connections you have, or how much power you wield, a life of crime will always catch up with you. Bulger spent 16 years on the run, but he couldn't run forever, and when his past finally caught up with him, ended up costing him his life. Now, let's shift gears and talk about a much more recent case that shook the criminal underworld to its very core, the story of Michael Torres, also known as The Fly. Torres wasn't your run-of-the-mill criminal. He was a big shot in the Mexican Mafia, one of America's most feared and influential prison gangs. Torres didn't just belong to this organization, he was one of its key players. Starting out with the San Fer gang in San Fernando Valley, Torres was sharp, but he channeled his smarts into illicit activities. While doing time at Pelican Bay State Prison in 1994, he was inducted into the Mexican Mafia. This wasn't just joining any gang, it was like being crowned in the criminal world.
Members of the Mexican Mafia were somebody that we had all heard of throughout our time. You know, as juveniles, as kids, we looked up to these guys.
After serving a 16-year stretch for manslaughter, Torres was released in the early 2000s. Instead of going straight, he dove deeper into crime. He became the Mexican Mafia's sanctioned tax collector in San Fernando Valley. Every criminal in the area had to pay Torres a share of their earnings. Refusing wasn't an option if you wanted to stay healthy. Torres controlled his turf ruthlessly and wasn't shy about getting his hands dirty. However, Torres's reign wasn't destined to last. He was caught and sent back to prison with a life sentence. You might think this would end his criminal activities, but you'd be wrong. From his cell, Torres took charge of the Los Angeles County jail system. Torres was pocketing thousands weekly while supposedly serving time. Torres was clever about it. He used smuggled cell phones to stay in touch with his subordinates, demanding detailed financial reports. He even broadened his operation, taxing gangs and drug dealers in San Fernando and Antelope Valleys, and investing the profits in legitimate ventures and real estate. But in the criminal underworld, being on top means there's always someone aiming for your position.
The California State Prison is investigating the stabbing death of an inmate. Torres had been serving a 133-year sentence for a list of crimes, including attempted murder, and was a third-strike offender.
He was assaulted by 2 inmates at California State Prison, Sacramento. The attackers, Ray Martinez and Juan Angel Martinez, fatally stabbed Torres. You might think, well, that's prison life, right? But here's the twist. Ray Martinez was also a Mexican Mafia member. This wasn't a random prison brawl.
When it comes down to it, you become a liability. Why? Because you know too much. So what they'll do to cover their asses, they'll eliminate you. If you go back into history, 99% of the victims of the Mexican Mafia have been their own members.
Torres's demise goes on to show that even at the pinnacle of organized crime, safety is never guaranteed. The very organization that empowered Torres ultimately failed to protect him. In the criminal world, genuine loyalty and friendship don't really exist. Today's partner could be tomorrow's assassin. Torres spent his life building a criminal empire, only to die alone in a prison cell, betrayed by one of his own. It's a harsh reminder that a life of crime is a dead-end street, and no matter how high you rise or how much power you amass, there's always someone waiting to take you down. Torres's story should make us reconsider the glamorization of gang life. Sure, he had power and wealth for a while, But what did it get him in the end? A violent death in a place where he believed he was untouchable. If there ever was a cautionary tale, this is it. Now, let's take a trip south of the border and dive into the story of a man who once controlled 80% of the world's cocaine trade. I'm talking about Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela, one of the founders of the infamous Cali Cartel.
The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration has put Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez on the top of their most wanted list.
Born on January 30th, 1939, in Mariquita, Colombia, Gilberto didn't start out as a drug lord. In fact, he and his brother Miguel began their careers in the criminal underworld with a kidnapping ring in the late 1960s. But it wasn't long before they saw the potential in the booming cocaine trade. In 1975, Gilberto, along with his brother Miguel and their associate Jose Santa Cruz Londoño, founded the Cali Cartel. Now, you might be thinking, wasn't Pablo Escobar the king of cocaine? Well, while Escobar and his Medellin cartel were making headlines with their violent tactics, the Cali Cartel was quietly building an empire.
The drug bosses based here in Cali like to think of themselves as corporate leaders rather than common criminals. As such, they prefer to draw on their billions of dollars in yearly profits to corrupt the police, judges, and politicians rather than killing them.
Gilberto, known as the chess player for his strategic thinking, took a different approach from Escobar. Instead of waging war against the Colombian government, he preferred bribery and corruption. He infiltrated Colombia's political and economic systems, building a network of informants and allies that made the cartel nearly untouchable. Under Gilberto's leadership, the Cali Cartel grew into a sophisticated, multinational corporation. They weren't just drug traffickers, they were businessmen. They owned everything from drugstores to radio stations, using legitimate businesses to launder their drug money. But Gilberto's ambition didn't stop at Colombia's borders. Despite the increased scrutiny, the Cali Cartel continued to thrive. By the early 1990s, they were supplying 80% of the world's cocaine and were estimated to be bringing in $8 billion a year. To put that in perspective, that's more than the GDP of some small countries. But as the saying goes, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. In June 1995, Colombian police finally caught up with Gilberto. In a scene that could have been straight out of a movie, they found him hiding in a secret compartment behind a bookcase in his Cali apartment. Gilberto's arrest was a major coup for Colombian authorities, but it wasn't the end of his story. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. But here's where things get interesting. In November 2002, after serving just 7 years, Gilberto was released due to a controversial court ruling. Now, you might think this was Gilberto's chance to retire and enjoy his ill-gotten gains. But the US government had other plans. They wanted Gilberto to face justice on American soil. In 2004, Gilberto was extradited to the United States. This wasn't just any extradition. It was a major diplomatic event. The Colombian president at the time, Alvaro Uribe, personally announced the extradition on national television. That's how big a deal Gilberto was. Gilberto faced a laundry list of charges, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. In September 2006, at the age of 67, he was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. It seemed like the final chapter in the story of one of the world's most powerful drug lords. But life in a US federal prison wasn't easy for the man who once lived like a king. Gilberto's health began to deteriorate. He suffered from prostate and colon cancer, as well as other ailments. His lawyers repeatedly petitioned for his early release on compassionate grounds, arguing that the prison conditions were killing him slowly, and he even gave interviews in order to garner sympathy.
¿Cómo siguió? ¿Cómo va su corazón?
Pues físicamente un poquito maltratado, pero espiritualmente bien, ¿saben?
But the US justice system wasn't swayed. Despite his declining health, Gilberto's crimes were considered too severe for any leniency. The man, who once controlled most of the world's cocaine trade, was now just another ailing inmate stuck in the federal prison system. On May 31st, 2022, at the age of 83, Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela died at a prison medical center in Butner, North Carolina. His lawyers put out a statement confirming the news. The chess player had played his final move. It's easy to look at the wealth and power of drug lords and be seduced by the glamour. But Gilberto's fate shows us the reality behind the facade. No matter how high you climb in the criminal world, the fall is always waiting. And when it comes, as it inevitably does, all the money and power in the world can't save you from facing the consequences of your actions. Now, let's pivot to a story that's as American as apple pie, but with a twist that'll make your head spin. We're talking about Joe Pegleg Morgan, a man who bridged two worlds in the most unexpected way. Born in 1929 in San Pedro, California, Joe Morgan seemed destined for a life of crime from the get-go. Growing up in a rough neighborhood during the Great Depression, young Joe quickly learned that sometimes you had to break the rules to get by. But here's where Joe's story takes its first unexpected turn. Despite his Anglo name and appearance, Joe grew up in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. He became fluent in Spanish and immersed himself in Mexican-American culture. Joe's life of crime started early. At just 16, he was convicted of his first felony. In 1946, Morgan took the life of another man, the father of his 16-year-old girlfriend, and he was sentenced to 9 years at San Quentin State Prison. Now, for most people, going to San Quentin as a teenager would be a nightmare. San Quentin's had some famous inmates over the years, people like Charles Manson or Sirhan, who shot and killed Robert Kennedy.
There is such a thing as evil, and some people are evil.
I can't live one way thinking I'm going to always get out. And I can't live the other way thinking I'm always going to stay in. Somehow I have to find resolution with both.
But for Joe Morgan, it was like going to crime college. It was here that he made connections with members of the Mexican Mafia, a prison gang that would later become one of the most feared criminal organizations in California. Joe didn't just connect with the Mexican Mafia, he thrived in it, despite being a white guy with a peg leg, the backstory of which being that he lost his leg in a railroad accident while trying to hop a freight train. After his release from San Quentin, Morgan continued his life of crime. He was in and out of prison for various offenses, including armed robbery and drug trafficking. But it was during these stints in prison that Morgan's influence in the Mexican Mafia grew. By the 1970s, Morgan had become one of the highest-ranking members of the Mexican Mafia. He was known as the Godfather of the organization, a title that was by no means an exaggeration. From behind bars, Morgan directed drug trafficking operations, ordered hits on rivals, and even influenced street gangs across Southern California. But Joe's reign wasn't without its challenges. In the 1980s, a younger generation of Mexican Mafia members began to resent the influence of this white man in their organization. In 1993, while serving a life sentence, Morgan received a diagnosis that would change everything: inoperable liver cancer. Now, you might think this would be the end of the road for the godfather of the Mexican Mafia, but Joe Morgan wasn't going to go quietly. Despite his illness, Morgan continued to wield influence from his prison cell. He was involved in peace negotiations between rival gangs and continued to have a say in the Mexican Mafia's operations. Joe Pegleg Morgan died on November 9, 1993, at the age of 64. He passed away in the prison medical facility where he had spent his final months. To the very end, he remained a paradox, a white man who had risen to the top of a Hispanic prison gang, a man who had spent most of his life behind bars but wielded enormous influence on the streets. Joe Pegleg Morgan's legacy is a complex one. To some, he was a criminal mastermind who helped build one of the most feared prison gangs in America. To others, he was a cautionary tale of a life wasted in pursuit of power and respect in all the wrong places. As we've seen through these four stories, Whitey Bulger, Michael Torres, Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela, and Joe Pegleg Morgan, the life of a high-ranking criminal is anything but glamorous. Sure, there might be periods of wealth, power, and influence, but the endgame is always the same: prison or death, and very often both. These men, each in their own way, thought they had beaten the system. Bulger played both sides, working as an FBI informant while running his criminal empire. Torres believed he could run the streets from behind bars. Orua built a drug empire that rivaled multinational corporations. And Morgan crossed cultural lines to become a leader in a world where he should have been an outsider.
People around here would like to sit in jail a little longer and not die.
It's easy to be seduced by the glamorized versions of the gangster life we see in movies and TV shows. The fancy cars, the expensive clothes, the respect and fear from others. It all looks so appealing on the surface, but the reality, as we've seen, is far grimmer. So the next time you hear someone glorifying the gangster lifestyle, remember these stories. These are the true faces of organized crime. Not the glamour, not the wealth, not the power, but lonely deaths in prison cells, betrayed by the very worlds they helped create. As we wrap up these chilling tales of crime and punishment, it's clear that the life of a gangster is far from glamorous. But what do you think? Are these cautionary tales or just the risks of the game? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video intriguing, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the dark world of organized crime. Hit that notification bell to stay updated on our latest uploads. Thanks for watching, and remember, crime doesn't pay. Until next time, stay safe.